We know a bit more about the terrorist attack yesterday in Paris, France, that murdered 12 people and injured more. Police say 3 Muslim terrorists were involved, including 2 brothers, one of whom was convicted in 2008 on terrorism charges. Just stop right there. We had one of these guys before, caught, charged, convicted, and then we set him free. Well, of course we did, because we are an increasingly unserious civilization. By we, I mean the West. Who catches a terrorist and then sets him free? Well, we do. The luxurious, comfortable, lazy, pampered, liberal West. Canada does it too. In Afghanistan, our troops caught plenty of terrorists, just like the U.S. did. And some of them were sent to POW camps for detention, like at Guantanamo Bay. You know how POW camps are supposed to work. Soldiers, or in this case terrorists, are kept there until the war is over. They're not necessarily charged with the crime. They're just held and not let back onto the battlefield. Well, the war is not over, but the United States has practically emptied out Guantanamo Bay of terrorists. Hundreds of leading terrorists just let go, many of whom have gone right back to the terrorist war against us, one of whom will be released into Canadian society soon enough. I'm talking about a terrorist murderer named Omar Khadr. Do you find it surprising that a convicted terrorist, let go in the society that he hates, would commit another terrorist murder? But that's what happens when you are unserious about fighting a war, unserious about calling your enemy by their proper name, unserious about protecting your freedom. So that was yesterday. Today, another terrorist murder in Paris. A Muslim terrorist wearing a bulletproof vest walked up to a female cop and just murdered her. Are you surprised? Why would you be surprised? There are terrorist attacks every single day, many every single day. It's just that they've moved from places like Iraq and Syria to places like Paris. Is that surprising? It happened in Ottawa too. Have you forgotten? Imagine if instead of 1 amateur terrorist, if there had been 3 terrorists, experienced terrorists, who had military-style training, who had stormed our Canadian Parliament Hill together as they stormed into the Charlie Hebdo magazine in Paris yesterday. There will be more terrorism tomorrow also. There will be more terrorism in Canada too. Why would it stop? I mean, some of these terrorists were born in the West, so they've been radicalized here, usually in mosques, until we shut down hate mosques in the West that exhort young extremists to become violent. Why would we expect that to stop? Oh, you think that just happens in Paris? Well, here's a Toronto Muslim imam speaking at the University of Waterloo, saying that Islam commands the punishment of death for those who insult Muhammad.
You're in a Muslim country and you insult Muhammad or Jesus, you will receive the same punishment. If a Christian does that in Saudi or in a Muslim country, he will get in trouble. But if he purposely do this, then it goes back to the ruler. Goes back to the ruler and the judge of that time. But it could also, be to the point as far as killing that person.
Kill that person. He's preaching this in public in Canada. Here's another Muslim imam in Montreal saying the same thing.
قالوا أما الثاني فقد حارب الله ورسوله وقد خرج إلى فئة باغية فليس جزاؤه القتل فقط ده جزاء حد الحرابة إنما جزاء الذين يحاربون الله ورسوله ويسعون في الأرض فسادا أن يقتلوا أو يصلبوا أو تقطع أيديهم وأرجلهم من خلاف.
Kill him. Do you expect there to be fewer radicalized youth committing murders if you have Muslim leaders in tax-exempt mosques preaching murder publicly? I mean, if those were Hell's Angels biker gang clubhouses and speeches by gang leaders, would we be so tolerant of their calls to kill? I mean, that's just the domestic problem. Of course, when you have 300,000 new immigrants a year, with a disproportionate number coming from terrorist-linked countries like Pakistan, Somalia, Egypt, Iran, are you shocked that some extremists continue to bring their jihad over here? Why? Do you think we screen our immigrants for their political values? Do you think we actually screen them at all? Do you think they are interviewed before they come to Canada? Do you think we even do a background check on them to see if they're extremists? Are you surprised that terrorism happens when we import tens of thousands of people a year from terrorist-infested countries. Why would that be surprising? Terrorism is a problem. The deaths and injuries are a problem, but the bigger problem is that we are actually terrified. The rest of us are terrified. Perhaps not all of us, but enough of us, especially those of us who have to be courageous. I mean, that's why the terrorists attacked a satirical magazine called Charlie Hebdo instead of attacking a shopping center or a power plant or a dam or something. They were attacked because they were journalists who had criticized Islam. And so the terror, the fear was concentrated on journalists across the West, and it worked immediately. The terrorists announced that they were avenging Allah, the Muslim God, by killing those who offended Islam. So across the West, cowardly journalists complied with the terrorists. They immediately did what the terrorists told them to do. They stopped offending Islam. Many had stopped criticizing Islam long ago, some right after Salman Rushdie was threatened with death in 1988 for writing the novel The Satanic Verses, many more in 2006 after the riots and death threats when a Danish newspaper published 12 cartoons of Mohammed. But yesterday was the actual murder of journalists. So the rest of the West journalists got the message, shut up about Islam. I mean, look at all these front pages from across UK newspapers today. Boy, they're so mad at these terrorists, so brave, so worked up, talking about freedom so much. Except you'll notice one thing, not a single one of them has an image of what the terrorists were attacking, a Charlie Hebdo cartoon about Mohammed. So all these newspapers complied. They were pretending to be brave, but they were complying. I mean, let me be very clear about one point here. I am not saying that the newspapers and TV stations of the West ought to get into the religious satire business. I mean, some of them might, but I'm not saying that a newspaper of record like the Daily Telegraph or Toronto's Globe and Mail should run a rather gross cartoon, gross aesthetically, gross politically. I'm not saying they should run that as their own editorial view. It's not their view, of course. I'm saying they should run the image to show what the news was about. Not to endorse Charlie Hebdo or its cartoons, but to, you know, commit journalism, to journal what happened. Charlie Hebdo published this cartoon. Muslim terrorists hated it, and so they killed a dozen people. How can you tell that story journalistically without showing the cartoon in question? Personally, I find the cartooning style of Charlie Hebdo a bit gross. A handful of them cross over into obscenity, actually. But again, just the other day, the Globe and Mail had the F word on their front page. They regularly have sexually explicit stories and images in them. Those Charlie cartoons are not any more obscene than anything else in the Globe and Mail, other than Muslims don't like them. So you have newspapers and TV stations omitting a journalistic fact from the story out of fear. I am not saying that the editorial position of anyone reporting on this terrorism should be, I support the meaning of the cartoons. I'm not even saying that. To report on terrorism, you have to believe in freedom of speech of Charlie Hebdo and its murdered staff. Though if you don't, you don't understand journalism in the West. I'm just talking about the simple trade craft of being a reporter, reporting what happened, telling the facts, instead of filtering them, censoring them out of fear. Do you see the difference? Do you see what I'm saying? It's not even that the Western media have changed their views on Islam. It's that they're not even the media anymore. A media means to be the middleman, to pass on the news from where it happens to where the viewers are. Now the media isn't the media. It's a filter blocking out things that their terrorist Muslim masters have told them to block out. Yesterday, I showed you that official CBC memo issued early in the day, just plain caving in. Not even pretending, just doing what they were told by the terrorists. The CBC itself has never been the target of terrorism. Paris is across the sea. But the CBC is so cowardly, so terrified, they complied without even being asked. Think about it. If a Canadian secular court had ordered a publication ban on something, told the CBC not to publish a particular fact, the CBC would hire lawyers and challenge that ban on the basis of freedom of speech and the Charter. Oh, they would have been so self-righteous. But here, a religious court, a fatwa, issued from the barrel of a gun in Paris, and the CBC complied submissively. They just submitted, which, if you know your Arabic, is the actual meaning of the word Islam, submission. But there's more to the CBC not showing these images, and I'll tell you about that next. Freedom of speech is under attack in the Western world, so how are journalists reacting? Well, the CBC reacted in cowardice. It's actually their official policy. Here, let me read to you from the CBC memo yesterday, just one more time. And I quote, "We wouldn't have published these images before today not out of fear, but out of respect for the beliefs and sensibilities of the mass of Muslim believers. Oh, really? So the most sensitive person in the room gets a veto over the news that's reported. Again, not the CBC's views or opinions, but their reporting of facts will now be subject to what they say is the mass of Muslim opinion. But which Muslims? Which Muslims did they ask? Radical clerics? Did they do a poll? Do they think Muslims who fled from Sharia hellholes came to Canada to have Sharia-compliant media here too? Of course not. They're just doing what the mass of Muslims tell them to. And even that, of course, would be illegitimate. They're doing it because 3 terrorists in Paris made it clear that it would offend their sensibilities. It's got nothing to do with the Muslim masses. You think that's bad? Well, the fool who issued that memo, David Studer, Director of Standards and Practices for CBC News, tried to explain his company's cowardice today on TV. Take a look.
Well, we start from the principle that we are a responsible news organization. Part of our job as Canada's national broadcaster is to promote tolerance and respect, and to recognize that unlike some other religions, in this case, some other religions where you see statues and you see pictures of deities, it's one of the tenets of Islam that the Prophet not be depicted in pictures or cartoons.
Really? Is that the job of a news agency? To promote harmony, to interpret religion? I thought it was to promote the news. What other facts are being kept hidden from us as the CBC tries to social engineer our thinking about the world and about Islam? The CBC is saying that they can't trust us with the facts of the world. We are too what? Too stupid? Too evil? Too sensitive? That we're too sensitive? That we're too bigoted? Or maybe that we will come to a conclusion that they won't like, namely, that we have to stand up to Muslim terrorism, not cower before it? Or is there condescension directed towards Muslims? Do they think that Muslims are by nature so excitable that if the CBC reports the news in the wrong way, we'll have terrorism here too? But it gets back to my main point. They're only censoring for one religion, the one religion that uses terrorism as a religious tool, for whom terrorism is embedded in their religious doctrines. I'm talking about radical Islam. The CBC does not care about social harmony or tolerance and respect for any other group. They report the facts and let the chips fall where they may. If there was a sexual abuse scandal in a Catholic orphanage in Newfoundland, just to pick a story, well, they reported it because it was the truth. And it was a news fact. And how people felt about Catholics was not the CBC's main job. And maybe the facts would properly inform how people should feel about the church. This isn't respect or tolerance. It is submission out of fear. One more clip from the CBC's Studer.
There will be others who will say, you know what, you're making a choice, you're being more sensitive to people's freedom of religion or religious sensibilities than you are to other people who really believe in freedom of expression and freedom of the press and are offended that we would make that decision.
Yeah, and I think that argument's got a hole in it, because I think, as I say, nothing particularly important turns on seeing these things. That they exist, like I've seen them, you know, anyone who wants to go online can see them. You don't learn much from seeing them beyond the fact that there are cartoons, that they're cartoons that some people might find funny, some others might find offensive. And I think our job is to stand back from that and say, look, they're there, they happened, this provoked this response, but we wouldn't have shown them the day before. Just because these gunmen did what they did isn't going to provoke us into it.
Oh my God. 2 things here. First of all, what is his job? The job of the CBC News is to show the news. But he is saying that, well, if it's really interesting, such as the central artifact in the biggest news story on earth right now, if it's important and controversial, well, Canadians can just find it themselves, go somewhere else, go Google it yourself. He said that. He said, go find it on the internet. Don't look to the CBC News for, well, news. Except, of course, CTV News is cowardly too, and so is Global News. It's the consortium, the media party, the cartel. They are all abdicating their coverage of news and becoming political social workers. No wonder they hate us here at the Sun News Network, because although they deride us, we actually show you the news. Who's the real journalist today? If it were something totally obscene or illegal, like, say, an image of child pornography, of course we would not show you that as a news item. Of course not. But these Charlie Hebdo cartoons and the Danish cartoons from 9 years ago, they're not obscene or illegal. They are the news, though. They are what the terrorists tell us we can't show. So they are not following their legal or ethical or aesthetic judgment here. They are following the terrorists' judgment. They have outsourced their editorial decisions to the terrorists. What a laugh. His last comment, though, they won't be provoked into showing the cartoons just because the terrorists killed 12 people over them. What a lie within a lie, because of course they are doing exactly what the terrorists are demanding. They do self-censoring. It's the self-deception that went along with it that's truly gross. But listen to what he's saying. He's saying, even if it were true, we're not going to report on the biggest news story just because it's the biggest news story. Sorry, why do we give these buffoons at the CBC $1 billion a year so they can tell us to go Google the news somewhere else? Hey, do you really believe that old slogan, the pen is mightier than the sword? Do you really? 3 gunmen in Paris just conquered the mind of the CBC, the Globe and Mail, and every newspaper in the United Kingdom. Look at the CBC using its TV station now not to report the news, but to explain why they shouldn't report the news, and we shouldn't too, to spin not only their own misconduct, but to spin the facts, just as the terrorists want them to. Oh, but he's not submitting to Islam. Just ask David Studer. This is sick. I want to say one more thing about the fake courage in the media. Look at all those journalists pretending to be standing up to terrorists, pretending to be standing with the murdered journalists, and you know they are because they're telling you they are. They're holding up little signs saying, "Je suis Charlie," which means I am Charlie, as in Charlie Hebdo. They're tweeting it, they're holding up signs, but none of them are actually holding up the cartoons, are they? I understand that a number of Quebec newspapers ran the cartoons today, and I congratulate them on that. Well, being journalists, I suppose that's something that you have to do these days, congratulate a journalist for actually doing the job of journalism. But what about the rest of the world? Even our own Toronto Sun didn't do it. Why? Well, holding up that hashtag, Je suis Charlie, is 2015's version of the lamest moment of 2014 when Michelle Obama and other preening celebrities looked very serious, taking selfies and posting the hashtag, Bring Back Our Girls. That was in response to another Muslim terrorist act, the kidnapping and rape of nearly 400 young Christian girls in Nigeria. Muslim terrorists called the Boko Haram kidnapped them and turned them into rape slaves, sold them. And you know what Michelle Obama did? Well, she proved how much she cared because she pouted and held up a sign saying, Bring Back Our Girls. And you know that the CBC cares because they say, Je suis Charlie. It's impotence and cowardice together in the face of Muslim terrorism. It's fake courage holding up that sign. But you know what? It's okay to be afraid. It's okay to be afraid of real-life monsters like Muslim terrorists are. That word, Islamophobia, it's okay to be afraid of radical Islam. But the misuse of the word Islamophobia, that there's something morally wrong with you if you're afraid of radical Islam, that's the real problem, actually. Being afraid isn't the problem. Pretending you're not afraid and destroying your own culture of liberty, that's the real problem. Why doesn't the CBC just say, look, we're afraid of being attacked, either violently or legally through a Human Rights Commission censorship complaint? Why doesn't the CBC's news policy people listen to their own reporter, Neil MacDonald, who last evening on The National explained that CBC and other major media they associate with were afraid to show the cartoons? He said it. Was he just crying in the wilderness, or is it a more honest assessment of the national broadcaster's lack of news judgment and integrity? Why not? I mean, isn't that the truth? As opposed to the pretzel-like excuses they're all making today. In today's Le Devoir, a Quebec newspaper, there was this story. Let me read the translation to you. It was about a Montreal columnist named Yves Boisvert, who had met with Charlie Hebdo's editor back in 2007, but decided not to print the cartoons of Muhammad back then. But here's what Boisvert said today in Le Devoir. This is a translation. He said, "There is one thing I regret not having said. We were afraid. Fear of a madman of God, fear of the murderer of Theo Van Gogh, afraid of those who threatened Philippe Val of Charlie Hebdo today. Not afraid of a trial or the legitimate anger of some. I mean fear for real, physically. And we did not even say it because we were ashamed of this fear." That's Yves Boisvert today. Being honest, getting a weight off his chest. He, like all the rest of the media party, made excuses for why they didn't run the cartoons 9 years ago, but he lied. But today he tells us the truth. It's because he was scared and he was too ashamed. He didn't want to say the real reason. But why not say so? We're all scared too. We know journalists are scared. They're cowardly by nature, and this is an unnatural threat to them, this terrorism. We know journalists are afraid. Fear can be managed. That can be helped. That can be forgiven. But lying about your fear, less so. And undermining real journalism as appeasement to beg in advance for mercy from terrorists, what the CBC is doing, that can never be forgiven.